Hello everyone, Skippy here, and welcome to One Piece episode 977, directed by Masahiro Hosoda and supervised by Kenji Yokoyama. With our first episode back to the present, I can't say I wasn't a little worried based off what the preview had in store, as it may not have shown all that much, but it didn't seem to me like Masahiro Hosoda would be doing that much more than his usual norm for this massive revelation for this arc and series as a whole. With the cool lighting for the port being pretty much gone and the compositing outside of the base level of it feeling pretty non-existent. Sure, Kenji Yokoyama's corrections are clearly going to be the star of the show once again, and again, the preview didn't really show much, but I'm still going into this one cautiously optimistic and hoping and praying that this moment is done the justice that it truly deserves and needs. So will episode 977 bring us back to the present with some real gravitas and impact despite Hosoda's body of work and Wano? Time to emerge from the sea and find out. This episode covers the remaining pages of chapter 974, and aside from showing Kanjuro at the port trapping Shinobu, and outright showing Nami complaining about Luffy and Zoro falling asleep as they arrive instead of it being off-screen, this episode follows the original chapter pretty closely with a few small alterations in dialogue structure here and there, which ends up being a detriment to it, I think. Now don't get me wrong, everything is actually done a fair bit of justice as far as raw adaptation goes, and I like a lot of the OST that was chosen for the scenes due to so many Stampede tracks being used. But the sluggish pacing throughout the entirety of the episode ends up kind of bringing it down a peg and makes you sit through a bunch of different reaction shots and stills that linger for far too long to pad the episode out. And that's with there being at least 7 minutes of opening and then recap, which should make the pacing better, but it never does. I still do feel the gravitas from every moment, thankfully, and Kanjuro's voice actor absolutely kills it with his more evil tone, but I honestly would have much rather had a lot of the content that was in the back half of the last episode be here to strengthen the pacing a bit, because there really isn't much that you can fillerize outside of what I already mentioned. It's got a great skeleton of an adaptation, but is one of the slowest episodes that we've seen in a minute, so it ends up feeling a bit mediocre all things considered, despite the core adaptation of the content being good. I must say that I'm impressed with how Hosoda's storyboard turned out here, as it's not some huge modern refreshing of his efforts, but aside from how hyper the close-ups can end up being, this episode is pretty ambitious in certain areas with certain camera shots, like us zipping through the scabbards on the boat as the possibility of there being a traitor is brought up, and when Kanjuro's reveal is done almost effortlessly yet so simply that I adore it, which goes along with Hosoda's compositing here that again feels subtle but pretty effective. I was pleasantly surprised with how things turned out on this front. I'm just so used to Hosoda's boards feeling extremely flat and bland, and sure there are some shots here and there, and they're also repeated en masse due to the likely low sheet count that this episode had combined with its pacing, but this is definitely still one of Hosoda's better showings in this arc, I will absolutely admit. And when Kenji Yokoyama's corrections are all around solid and include some assistance from Chief Supervisor Keiichi Ichikawa, 977 is saved primarily by its content at its core and some surprising direction and storyboard from Hosoda. When the big moments are happening, the episode truly does hit its stride and feels great. But I can't really ignore how much the pacing surrounding it bogs it down a peg and doesn't make it nearly as solid as it could be. Which is a shame when you think of what it could have been if the content was just slightly moved over a tad, but it still results in a fairly meh episode on the whole that has some highlights for damn sure, but also has some really bad pacing as well. Next week though, it thankfully looks like we won't be bound by sluggish pacing again with episode 978 that looks pretty damn great all in all. Well, it looks like Shuichi Ito's corrections are already giving this episode a polished look to begin with, but the storyboard and what's shown of the action animation of the worst generation fighting looks absolutely incredible, and seems to feature the likes of Masami Mori, Tetsuro Nireki, and many others. Tie that all down with it seemingly being chief supervised by Matsuda and making it the first time in a while that she's corrected someone other than Zoro, and I end up majorly looking forward to this episode as it looks like it'll be one hell of a fun romp to really kick off Onegaishima. Anyways guys, that's it for now. I'm Skippy, and it was a bit jarring going back to the eye catches for acts 1 and 2, I will admit.